You know that in 1929, two researchers turned a live cat into a telephone? And I know what you're thinking, there is literally no way. But sure enough, two scientists from Princeton wanted to test how the auditory nerve perceives sound, so they cut out a piece of the cat's brain and went to work. So while the cat was heavily sedated but still very much alive, they attached one side of the wire to the auditory nerve of the cat and the other to a receiver, and they just began talking back and forth with a normal conversation. A little strange if you ask me. Back in the early 1900s, there was a Russian mystic named Rasputin, and he survived not one, not two, but 3 assassination attempts on him. The first attempt, someone tried to poison him. The second attempt, someone shot him. And the third attempt, someone stabbed him. And yet he was still kicking after all of this. And eventually he was wrapped in a blanket and thrown in a river, and that's how he died. But not before assassins cut off his private parts and pickled them in a jar.
Today people use Facetune to alter their photos, but in the past people used different methods to change their portraits. In 1539, Anne of Cleves traveled from Germany to meet her fiancé, King Henry VIII, for the first time. When she arrived, Henry was livid and threw a temper tantrum. He claimed that she looked nothing like her portrait and that it covered up her long nose and the smallpox markings on her skin. But the wedding proceeded anyway. On the night of their wedding, Henry couldn't get it up and he blamed it on Anne's appearance. The marriage only lasted for 6 months. Henry's chief minister was charged for treason for arranging this marriage. Anne did receive a large settlement which included Richmond Palace and Hever Castle.
Today we're looking at some of the most evil rulers in ancient history. Let's get it started. First we've got Attila the Hun. Leader of the Hunnic Empire in the mid-400s, his methods for conquering new lands were some of the most savage and brutal in history. He did not care if you were an enemy or one of his own people, murder was a daily occurrence in his life. He had a thirsty appetite for drinking women's blood. He even died by drowning in a pool of his own blood. Next up is Qin Shi Huang. He was the very first and the most cruel ever emperor of China. He's responsible for the Great Wall of China, which was built on the bone and blood of his people that he starved and murdered. He was obsessed with the afterlife and murdered 500 scientists because they couldn't tell him about immortality. Lastly is Wu Zetian. She ruled China from 690 to 705 and is the only woman who ruled China. She was cruel, sadistic, and ruthless. She ordered tortures and executions daily and no enemy was ever spared. She even killed her own children.
On the 30th of January 1886, 59-year-old Betty Mote from Shetland, Scotland, had planned to travel from the southern tip of the island to the capital to sell her knitted wares. She took a bottle of milk and 2 biscuits for the journey and headed off. Betty was the only passenger on the Columbine, the ship that would get her there. Tragedy struck when the Columbine hit heavy seas, throwing the captain overboard. When the crew tried to save him, they too ended up in the water. Betty, hiding below deck, didn't know any of this until she made her way above. She was alone on the Columbine, drifting away from the Shetland Islands. For 9 days, Betty drifted alone across the North Sea, beaten by storms with only her milk and biscuits to survive on. Somehow, the Columbine grounded itself on a beach in Norway. Betty's journey should have taken less than 3 hours. Her story inspired headlines in newspapers around the world. Even Queen Victoria was so touched by her story, she requested a cheque of £20 be sent to Betty. After a warm welcome back in Shetland, Betty returned to Sunburg, where she lived until the age of 93.
Yo, Polly was out here stabbing slave catchers with butcher knives and throwing hot boiling water on them to free us. If that ain't a G, I don't know what is. But let me explain. We don't know much about Polly's early life, but we do know that she was enslaved and she escaped to a place called Africa, Ohio. That place is now called Ripley, Ohio, and it's literally a stone's throw away from Kentucky, which is slave territory. Because of that, Polly saw a lot of stuff she ain't really like. For example, after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, white folks were incentivized to catch any black person and sell them into slavery. And because she was on this border, she saw a lot of white folks acting like they were Underground Railroad conductors when they were actually slave catchers or overseers. She knew they wanted younger black folks, so she dressed up like an older woman and went to town with clothing that was large enough to conceal her weapons. So whenever she saw a slave catcher in action, she pulled out that thing, that knife and that boiling water. And afterwards, when she freed us, she let us stay on her land.
So here's a piece of history you didn't need to know today. King Tut here was a product of incest. His parents were brother and sister. Ancient Egyptians believed that incest kept the bloodline pure. He had clubbed feet, a severe overbite, buck teeth, womanly hips, and enlarged jugs.
Until 2016, the Happy Birthday song was not for public use, meaning that prior to 2016 the song was copyrighted and you had to pay a license to use it. The oldest "your mum" joke was discovered on a 3,500-year-old Babylonian tablet. Olive Ann Oatman was the first white American person to have a tattoo. Before drones were invented, photographers used pigeons for aerial photos.
During the American Civil War, a man named W.V. Meadows was shot in the eye during the Battle of Vicksburg. You see, not only did he survive, he coughed the bullet out of his mouth 58 years later. King Guijan of Yu placed convicted criminals in front of his army. But before they went into battle, the criminals would cut off their own heads to scare off the enemy's army.
In 1386, a pig in France was dressed in human clothes, tried in court, and sentenced to death for the murder of a child. This is the flag of River G County in Liberia, known to many as the ugliest flag in history. American writer Edgar Allan Poe married his first cousin Virginia when she was only 13 years old. This is a piece of cake still intact dating back to the wedding of Queen Victoria in 1840.
If you make it all the way through this haunted house, you win $20,000, except there's a reason why no one has ever made it. McCaney Manor is considered the scariest haunted house in the world, except that it's actually a literal torture chamber. The attraction can last up to 8 hours, but the longest anyone has ever made it is 6. Participants sometimes get locked in small confined areas, get their hair shaved off, get punched in the face, and even have their teeth pulled out. How lovely. But this is all legal because you have to sign a 40-page waiver before you can participate. Despite all of the controversy, there's an insanely long wait list to get into this attraction, and no one has ever made it through the whole thing.
When whales reach a certain age, they will eventually be too weak to swim back to the surface for air, so they will just suffocate to death and eventually sink to the bottom of the ocean. When you die, you will be aware that you are dead until the moment your brain fully ceases function. When getting laser eye surgery, you can smell the parts of your eyes being shaved down. During the French Revolution, where the guillotine was introduced, the people to be executed fought to be first, as the blade would dull after multiple uses, and wouldn't cut a head clean off at the first attempt. If you're male, after you die, your loved ones can have a doctor electrocute your prostate to force you to ejaculate for sperm. Humans have enough bite power to bite off their own finger, bone and all. The only thing stopping us is our brain's natural safety factor. A deceased human body can take between 24 to 48 hours to decompress, releasing the remaining blood, urine, and fecal matter, depending on the situation, position, and method of death. If you die on a submarine, they put your body in the fridge with all the food. If not, up a torpedo tube. It's actually common that corpses will periodically burp, fart, gasp, groan as gases escape through the mouth and anus. When you get burned by electricity, it actually leaves marks shaped like lightning on your skin.
The first firefighter killed in 9/11 attacks was struck dead by a falling body in the courtyard. One of them was killed on his way in, and the other was killed on his way out. Right now, there are tiny little bugs on your face munching on your dead skin. Your bones are wet. If you don't have kids, you will break an unbroken line of children that has gone on for tens of millions of years. A scientist studying death asked a man who was about to be executed by a guillotine if he would blink after his head was chopped off. He ended up blinking for 30 seconds. Most laugh tracks for TV shows were recorded in the early 1950s, meaning that you hear dead people laugh. If you're attacked by a bear, it won't try to kill you like other predators. Instead, it'll just start eating you. One day, someone will mention you for the last time, then they'll never ever mention you again. This photo shows 8-month-old Zhao Bao, who was lucky to be alive because his mother stabbed him 90 times after he bit her while she was breastfeeding him. The world's scariest haunted house, McCaney Manor, requires you to sign a 40-page waiver and undergo a physical and mental evaluation. If you manage to make it through the house, you could win $20,000. But to this day, no one has ever made it through. The little girl who voiced Ducky in The Land Before Time was shot to death by her father, who then committed suicide. Roman Emperor Nero had a boy castrated, dressed him up as a bride, and married him, all because the boy looked similar to his previous dead wife. A 46-year-old man found and attacked a 13-year-old boy because the kid was killing him too many times in a game of Call of Duty.